Hello everyone, welcome to Apollo's Artifacts. I am your host, Joshua Smith. In this episode, I'll be introducing you to the horrors of Boy Scout Troop 137. But before we get into it, I'd like to show you this real quick so you can look it up for yourself. These are what are known as the Boy Scout Perversion Files. It's an entire database that is searchable by state, and then you can see the crimes that were involved by various members of the Boy Scouts. The number of victimizers and victims number into the thousands. I will link this below so you can see it for yourself. Now as I begin, what you're seeing right now is the article that I will be reading from. I will link that below so you can check that out as well. However, as I do so, I want you to actually see the victim. In this case, we'll see a number of parallels between the Franklin scandal or the Franklin cover-up and a number of other abuse cases. There's also an interesting and disturbing overlap between the Boy Scout scandals and the Catholic Church scandals in this case. Boy Scout Troop 137 seems to have been set up for one purpose and one purpose only, to arrange for abusers to find victims. This takes us back to the mid-1970s. Title: Investigator details bust of pedophile ring tied to New Orleans Boy Scout troop. And due to the YouTube algorithm, I will have to substitute some words here. I have to be very careful about what I read and what I do not. You can see the full thing for yourself. Mason Spong had no idea that the case he worked in 1976 as a young NOPD detective, New Orleans Police Department, would change his life. A man saw some sexually explicit pictures of young children and he reported it, Spong said. Spong says that tip would lead investigators to a pedophile ring connected to Boy Scout Troop 137. These guys moved in and were able to gain control of this scout troop, Spong said. They took these kids across the lake to K-Bar B Ranch, and they had blank acts with them over in St. Tammany. And this went on for a while, a couple of years before we even came onto these pictures that were turned over to us. They were very young and very angelic children, very friendly, outgoing most of the times. The common denominator was a single-parent home, basically poor. And those indeed are factors that will turn up time and time again as you look into these many cases. Spong says men traveled to New Orleans to have blank with these boys, and the children were even taken across state lines. These adults had money to some degree, you know. They were middle class, and those pedophiles would come in from out of town and have that blank contact here in New Orleans in the homes of these other pedophiles. That's how it happened, Spong said. As part of his investigation, Spong met a little boy named Ricky. That's the individual in the picture here. He was a tiny little boy, Spong said. Like I said, he was frail. His personality was twice as big as his body, you know. He was a good kid. That boy was Richard Windman, the same man who says Jesuit high school's janitor, Peter Monica, blanked him in the 1970s while priest Cornelius Carr watched. And you'll find out from some of the other articles he did a little bit more than watch. Windman says Jesuit High School paid him $450,000 in a settlement for that abuse. Reporter: Were you able to corroborate everything Richard Windman told you as a little boy? Spong: Yes, everything. Spong, who is now an investigator for the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office, says Raymond Woodall, Richard Stanley. Spong, who is now an investigator for the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office, says Raymond Woodall, Richard Stanley Halverson, Harry Kramer, and Louis Seil were the troop ringleaders. Reporter: Richard Windman would be critical in helping you solve and prosecute this case. Spong: Yes, he was, because I think at some point Ricky was able to speak to these other children, and he got them all to trust us. Windman says all four men blanked him. Spong was in the courtroom that day in the late 1970s when Windman testified. And I want you to keep this in mind when you're thinking about the McMartin trial. That's one of the things that happened to those kids as they were put on the stand, according to everybody, including those sympathetic to the defense, said that the way that those children were treated on the stand was unconscionable. And that was really the center point where the satanic panic mythos was born. It was born with the defense team at the McMartin trial. And it spread out from there. It was picked up by a lot of secularists who already operated on the assumption that Satanism does not even exist, much less Satanism that is combined with other types of, say, ritualistic abuse aspects. And they helped to create what I would say is at least a partially false belief system related to the so-called satanic panic. Continuing here, quote, It was kind of gut-wrenching because I have heard these different stories from these different children, and then to hear it again and to watch Ricky testify, he was pretty good. He brought all the facts forward. He was looking at nothing but adults in the courtroom, strangers, plus he had the press there. It was horrible, Windman said. I mean, you feel embarrassed. You feel like you've done something wrong, and you're sitting there in a courtroom full of adults and media, and you're asked to recount all this. Spong says as the case progressed, the detectives involved kept watch over the young victims, but the investigator checking in on Windman was moved to another assignment. So Windman was introduced to the lead detective in the NOPD's child abuse unit at the time, Stanley Burkhart. Quote, the detective asked Stanley Burkhart to keep an eye on him, because Ricky was special to us, Spong said. I had 3 other kids that were special to me that I tried to keep a watch on. But instead of being protected, Windman says he was victimized once again when Burkhart blanked him. Burkhart definitely knew the Boy Scouts, Windman said. All of these guys in Burkhart also knew Jesuit High School. I played basketball in the back of Jesuit, and there was Burkhart and Peter Monica on the sidelines, so they knew each other. Monica was the aforementioned janitor who first blanked this poor child. Burkhart was convicted of numerous sex crimes in the 80s and 90s, including possessing CP and aggravated crimes against nature for molesting a young female relative. He was never prosecuted for Windman's allegations. But according to court documents, Windman was called to North Carolina as a witness in a 2011 federal case against Burkhart. The court concluded at the time that Burkhart was a sexually dangerous person. I would say that's to say the least. And in coming to that opinion, the judge cited significant events in Burkhart's life, including that, quote, while a police officer, he molested Richard Windman, a young boy at the time. The opinion also says the court finds clear and convincing evidence that the testimony of Mr. Windman is credible, and the denial by Burkhart in this incident is not credible. It was almost more gut-wrenching to hear that one of our own abused Ricky, Spong said. To me, it was worse than the initial blow when we first started investigating the case that one of our guys violated this child. It was tough. Spong says it is not uncommon for a child to be victimized over and over again like Windman was. And if you just look into the Franklin scandal, the Franklin cover-up, you'll see that that indeed was the case for Paul Benassi and Alicia Owen, Troy Bonner, and Danny King. Continuing, they were able to hear the stories that one pedophile would tell another, Spong said. Before you know it, the child was passed on. So that's kind of how it happens. And I will move from there to a second article. Victim calls for transparency after more Scout troop leaders are suspected of child sex abuse. And what I'll do in this article is skip down a bit here to get to the parts about the Boy Scout Troop 137. The article says here, in the 1970s, New Orleans police found the infamous Boy Scout Troop 137 was running a child pedophile ring, and Windman said he was one of those victims. He said he was recruited when Troop 137 started canvassing neighborhoods. Windman remembers how strange it was that he skipped Cub Scouts and went straight to being a Boy Scout. It says, soon after, nighttime trips began. Windman said, that's where I was first molested at Tom Woodall's house by Harry Kramer, and it went on for years. They would literally fly in from out of town. It was a huge pedophile network. The Boy Scouts was just a front for network pedophiles. And if you can remember, if you've happened to have heard this or if you can find it, there's an interview with Rusty Nelson where he says that the Franklin Credit Union of Larry King's was just a front for this very same thing. So continuing here, Tom and Raymond Woodall's names, Harry Kramer's name, and Richard Stanley Halverson's names all appear on the 2012 list made public by the Boy Scouts of America. But according to new court testimony out of New York and New Jersey, more Scout leaders than previously known publicly were involved in sexually abusing children. A total of 7,800 leaders and an estimated 12,000 victims dating back to the 1940s. However, one of the things not pointed out here is that they actually caught the Boy Scouts destroying numerous records, so we don't even really know the numbers. It could be many thousands higher than this. Then I'll move from there to this article. And many of these are in the New Orleans Advocate from the Times-Picayune. And one of the disturbing things that we find out here is that not only was Burkhart the person who abused Windman as a child, also became the chief of the NOPD's Child Abuse Unit. And we find out in the next paragraph here, quote, He allegedly blanked the boy repeatedly, years before pleading guilty to molesting a young relative and possessing CP in separate cases. I'll move down a few paragraphs here and we read, "It might seem implausible, if not impossible, that Windman could have been at the intersection of 3 scandals whose consequences still reverberate today: New Orleans' so-called Boy Scout case, Burkhart's unmasking as a child predator, and the plague of abuse by clergy and employees of Catholic institutions." And of course, in the Franklin cover-up, we have all of these things as well. And that is actually pointed up in the next paragraph where we find, "Yet such an overlap is not as uncommon as it might seem. A 1997 study from the University of Texas Health Science Center at San Antonio, for instance, found that nearly half of 538 adolescents and young adults surveyed in the institution's waiting rooms had reported unwanted sexual experiences. Of those, about 37% had unwanted sexual experiences, quote, with more than one perpetrator." Continuing a bit further down, it says, "The common thread is the individual abused is left at an increased level of vulnerability," said Katelyn Brewer, Chief Executive Officer of Darkness to Light, a nonprofit working to prevent child sex abuse. "These victims often don't disclose, and without disclosure, there's no opportunity for therapy, counseling, support, confidence building. So the trauma continues to manifest itself within that victim, and abusers prey on that. And it's almost like they're able to see it a mile away. You know, they can pick out their victims so easily where other people would just totally miss it." And a bit further down here, you'll see what I was talking about before that the other article made no reference to. So when Peter Monica, the janitor, was abusing young Windman, and it said that a Catholic priest, Cornelius Neil Carr, was watching, he was doing more than that. As you can see here, he was observing and pleasuring himself. And as we come down a bit further, we finally see how this whole case took off. It was because of a store employee who was developing film and found pictures of leaders of the Boy Scout Troop 137 engaging in these horrible acts with young boys. And then if you look at the next paragraph, you'll see, after Spong and his colleagues were given the pictures, they learned that the men in them had formed part of a referral service of sorts that sent boys around the country for pedophiles to abuse. This ring had members in several states and even in England, investigators learned, so it was international in scope, not just national. And moving down a bit further, we see here, but Spong said authorities managed to secure the cooperation of a former troop leader named Louis Sayal, who feared being convicted of blank and receiving a life sentence. Sayal ultimately corroborated the statements of several, mostly underprivileged troop members between the ages of 11 and 15, who told investigators their scoutmasters had horribly assaulted them in ways that I can't mention here. We move down a bit further here and we find out that the prosecuting attorney was D.A. Harry Connick Sr. That would be the father of the pianist and singer Harry Connick Jr. And we have another key paragraph here from one of the prosecutors. He said, quote, "Today people are more cognizant that it does happen and are on the lookout for circumstances that could be warning signs. But back then, it was harder to see, for lack of a better term." And as we move a bit further down, we finally find out here that the individual in Burkhart's family who he abused was a 9-year-old relative. The rest of the articles seem to not want to mention those facts for whatever reason. And then we find out even more disturbing facts when we look more into Windman's case, where he talks about when he had been victimized by Burkhart. It says here, quote, "During that proceeding, Burkhart's defense attorney asked Windman whether he had tried to tell police. Windman replied that he had reported it to a pair of officers who knew Burkhart well, but they did not do anything. It wasn't until this week that the NOPD took a formal complaint from Windman." So here it is, just like we have in the Franklin case, just like in the Franklin cover-up, we have people who went to the police and gave reports, and there was nothing done about it. And then as I move on to this next article, we'll see that Troop 137 is not even the only one by a long shot in this area of New Orleans. The headline here, Boy Scout files show nearly 20 sex abuse cases with New Orleans connections. And what I find so interesting about this is the way that as you move through these different articles, you're able to compile more and more information about what really went on back then, because no single article seems to have all of the relevant facts. So we come down to this paragraph here, and what we find out is this. 3 others on the list became familiar names in media reports in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Raymond Woodall, Richard Stanley Halverson, and Harry Kramer were among 17 people arrested in 1976 in the Boy Scout sex case that shook the city and tarnished the Scouts' local reputation for years to come. And of course, if you were outside of this, you probably didn't hear much of anything at all about this case. It's only if you specifically start doing research in these areas that you'll find these things. And here's where you find out more disturbing things that I started this off with, which is that the unit itself was founded entirely for this purpose. Quote, the men, along with Louis Syall, who was not named in the Scouts files, decided in 1974 to found a Boy Scout unit, Troop 137, in eastern New Orleans in order to, quote, provide them with boys for their sexual pleasure, Syall later testified. So this was not just some incidental outcome from the group. It was founded for this specific purpose of getting victims. And then we find out here, in September 1976, an employee at a commercial photo developer processed a roll of film containing 18 pictures of a 15-year-old boy being blanked by his scoutmaster and his adult friends. Police said that they learned that the group had recruited poor children from broken homes, a tactic consistent with the Los Angeles Times analysis of the Scouts files from across the country. They bought the boys' affection with bicycles and uniforms and invited them to, quote, sleepovers and skinny dipping parties, another nationwide trend the California newspaper discovered. And this is also something that came out in the documentary called An Open Secret that I have promoted on this channel many times before. Moving down a bit further here, Troop 137, authorities learned, quote, was the nucleus of a nationwide sex and pornography ring, with boys recruited into the troop sent to other states for the pleasure of the men there, according to a Times-Picayune report on the trials. 17 adults were arrested, including the 4 New Orleans Scout leaders, a Tennessee minister who ran a home for wayward boys, an official from a Florida school for children with learning disabilities, a prominent New Orleans landscape painter, and a Boston millionaire. And we find out a bit further down in the same article, which is very revealing, talks about the people who were in charge of this information. Quote, he says things are very fragile and fears any media exposure will be a disaster to scouting locally. He is hoping if and when charges are filed that they may not come to the media's attention. So this is how they wanted to cover up these things. And then moving down a bit more, it says here about the Perversion Files are one of the more comprehensive collections of child sexual abuse cases ever compiled. They were meant to permanently ban suspected child abusers from the organization. But the Los Angeles Times investigation found that the collection also chronicled patterns the Scouts shared with the Roman Catholic Church and Penn State abuse scandals of recent years, including the organization's failure to report hundreds of cases of alleged abuse to police and often hiding of allegations from parents. So here, parents, your children may have been abused, adults may have known, in positions of responsibility and power, and they never even bothered to tell you. And here we find something that is absolutely beyond belief. It is completely disgusting. It says, quote, in 80% of 500 cases across the nation where the Scouts were the first to learn of suspected abuse, the Los Angeles Times reported there is no record that the information was ever forwarded to police. So this is one of the big things you can use against the naysayers. And then as we move down a little bit more, we see here what I was telling you about previously. An unknown number of files have been destroyed. And here I move on to the final article. Boy Scouts and Catholic Church were inclined to silence on abuse. And here we're introduced to another shocking and disturbing case. A few paragraphs down in this article it says, after Catholic priest Gilbert Galta was found to be a child molester in 1974, then Lafayette Bishop Gerard Frey decided a change was in order. So the next year, Galta was assigned extra duties. He became chaplain of the diocesan Boy Scouts. Any pedophile would have whooped, and Galta took full advantage. And a little bit further down, we see here that Louisiana always figured prominently in the scandals that engulfed both institutions nationwide. And then we see here an example of how the cover-up took place, as we have a quote from a high-ranking person in the mid-1980s who said, quote, "We don't want to give the impression that it's a rampant problem for the church, because it's not." And I just thought that this short perusal through these different articles on this would help to introduce you to the earliest Boy Scout sex case, and perhaps some others will begin to look a little bit more deeply into Troop 137. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.